And now I'm so pleased to introduce our keynote session, Land of the Great Rivers, from Paxsayek to Noyack, from reciprocity to extraction to recognition. This multidisciplinary panel will present the narrative of land and people across the vibrant waterways. Native systems of reciprocity in this region among people and land were replaced by extreme exploitation under global colonialism. From the long and rich unwritten past of Turtle Island, through colonization and enslavement, through co-resistance and co-survival of Indigenous, African, and Afro-Indigenous communities, into exploitation and removal under assimilation and industrialization. The legacy of our mother and the people survives, informing our present and educating our future. Our esteemed panelists include James Amamusser, PhD, who's a research specialist at the New Jersey Historical Society. He's also a political science lecturer at Rutgers University, Newark. Noham Kashet Schilling is medicine elder for Bridge in the Sky Medicine Circle, advisor for Osawa Foundation, chair of Massachusetts Ethical Archaeology Society, and author. Carrie Hardy is a historical ecologist and has served since 2017 as the lead researcher, analyst, and cartographer for the Public History Project. He is the author of Notes on a Lost Flute, a field guide of the Wabanaki, and is currently at work on a forthcoming book, Gainful Pillage, A Public History. Jack Tehen, is a historian, curator, organizer, and dumpster diver. He is currently the Clement A. Price Professor of Public History and Humanities and director of the Price Institute, Rutgers, Newark. Teresa Vega, with almost 2 decades dedicated to family history and genealogy, merged traditional and genetic genealogy research in 2010. Her efforts trace maternal mixed race lines to colonial New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia. She found direct ancestral ties to First Africans, Afro-Dutch, and Malagasy arrivals, as well as the Munsee Lenape. So I thank you all for being here, and I'm so looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see everybody here. First, I just wanted to say that I actually studied. Rob Snyder is here, right? Rob, where are you? Rob Snyder and I were actually studied under Patricia Bonamy, so it's actually wonderful to have this award named after, well, in her honor, and congratulations, Professor Hauptman. All of our work really, of course, our work builds on the work of archivists, librarians, scholars who have done the good work. And so we very much could not be doing this kind of work if it wasn't for the kind of scholarship that you've dedicated your life towards. So thank you very much. It's good to be here in the Carol Huxley Theater. I actually knew Carol Huxley when she was active here, and Larry Hackman as well. So these are people that I feel very indebted to in terms of the role they played in supporting the kind of work we do. I actually have a little quote by Carol, but I'll see if we have time for me to read it. In some ways, it's appropriate for this time because we're living in such a time of daily anxiety and harm and violence that it's a time that we all need to be able to take a deep breath, many deep breaths, every morning, every afternoon, every evening, and remind ourselves what are the important things. So there's a beautiful quote that I saw online from Carol, so I'm hoping to get a chance to read that. Also, thank you to Jennifer and to Devin. Thank you very much for inviting us to present this work. It is a time of many crises. It's a good time for that very reason to gather in a space like this and to be just talking and reflecting, eating together and sharing food and sharing drink. It's a way to ask ourselves honest and clear questions about what we're doing and what we spent the past decades, many decades. Some of us, 50, I don't even want to count, 55 years, yeah. And what happens to that work? And how can we deal with these pivot points that are not unique, quite frankly, in terms of American history? We know that, but they're devastating and they're challenging nonetheless. So we, as a community of researchers who are journeying through very specific times and very specific places and sometimes get lost, I keep on talking about, well, I'm talking about like 2025, but I keep on saying, something like 1625, so we're constantly in some ways time traveling, and sometimes it's hard to keep straight with things. But at the same time, I think by having that historical imagination and understanding, it actually does help us get through moments like this in terms of understanding what's actually going on. I'm honored to be collaborating with each and every person on this panel. Some of us have been working together for a number of years. Some of us are fairly recent acquaintances, but each and every one of them is brilliant and have been diving deeply into their specific area of work. But part of the difficulty of the work that we do is that we all are necessarily specialists, and perhaps if we work long enough, we can begin to get a kind of a broader view. But part of the challenge of that is the rare opportunity, certainly in academia, that's true, but I can imagine it's true. I mean, I've come out of community museum work as well, where we're isolated in our communities because we are dealing with the daily issues of just, cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the toilets, taking care of things that people don't imagine people in museums take care of. So we're oftentimes caught up in the work we're doing to not have enough time to actually talk together and gather and to begin to compare notes. Because we know in each local area that we're looking at, we're not just talking about that local area. We're actually talking about larger patterns and larger interconnections. But it's so easy to get lost in that. And that's certainly true in academia, where there's so much hyper-specialization and you're rewarded the more specialized you are. In some ways, the more you're rewarded. But that's a problem. It's a problem because we can't always come together, reflect, and talk about the interconnections that are there. So part of what's happened with the Public History Project as it's emerged, which comes out of the New York City Bill de Blasio, Mayor Bill de Blasio's commission on monuments that I served on. So the Public History Project emerged out of that, which was really to say that all these separate monuments actually don't only make so much sense, but how can we begin to look at the larger patterns of New York City itself and what the monuments somehow mean and what the fight for the monuments mean. So in some ways, we're talking about memory work. But the difficulty is, as I've come to think of it in the Public History Project work, is that it's actually very hard to get academics involved in some of the questions that we're trying to look at. So I'm really delighted by the fact that we have independent scholars who are each brilliant, have done fantastic work in their own way, who are thinking of the big questions because it's their life. It's at the core of what they believe in doing. So that's what we have a chance today to kind of have people be talking each individually, but also with each other. And this is the first chance, so in some ways I'm very excited to be doing this, that we get to speak in front of an audience together. And these are discussions, as you can imagine, that happen over restaurant tables, over breakfast tables, and that kind of thing. So in some ways, you're getting a chance to kind of see some of that process that's actually quite exciting and very nurturing. So we're taking on the fundamental question of our many interconnections in this region. And we're specifically focusing on kind of the lower Hudson River, the river that flows two ways, the estuary of that ecoregion itself. But of course, we're part of a larger region that New Amsterdam is connected to, Albany as well, et cetera, et cetera. But how can we begin to think about the big questions that are interconnecting all of us? So the one I'm thinking of here is really the one that Peter Fitzpatrick, the legal scholar, began to talk about when he wrote The Mythology of Modern Law in 1992, where he concluded that the mythology of Western law is that it is not a mythic story. So part of what we're really looking at is the foundational questions, the foundational assumptions of what makes this region a region and what that story has been. And how can we begin to, what we know, how can we begin to challenge the power of some of these mythological stories that are repeated time and time again, and we know better from the historical research that's been done, but we still are caught and captured by these earlier narratives. So today is a chance for the Public History Project to do some of this work together. In many ways, all of us have been laboring in a vineyard and maybe focusing on a particular vine and then focusing on a particular bud, but this is a chance for us to begin to look at the whole plant, the whole vineyard, the ecology of the space itself, to begin to put these fragments and pieces together. So this is the work that we're beginning with the Public History Project, and we recognize it's something that's multi-generational. It's not something that any of us are claiming as our work, but it's really linked to the work that so many of you have been doing and the work that so many younger scholars are now emerging and getting very excited about doing. And part of the question is, how do these foundational questions of the origins of the land that we're on, the rivers that we're on, and the peoples who have been here, but how colonization impacts that, how is that all connected and relevant to the various kinds of crises that we're facing today? Of course, before the recent election, I was mainly thinking, and many of us were mainly thinking, of the global climate change, the global warming crises that we're in. But now we're in multiple crises, compounding and setting us back in ways that we perhaps didn't anticipate. So that's a part of what this work is about as well. So this is really just the beginning of a dialogue, and I just wanted to then first reintroduce Noham Kashat Schilling, who, when I asked, you've heard their biographies, but when I asked each one of them what they would like to be referred to as, Noham said, medicine person by training, a researcher, a cultural healer, and a small family farmer. So Noham, please join us here. Thank you. Are you okay with the screen here?
Yep. Thank you. Stay there. So, I'm here to talk. My name is Noham. It means goes by water. My aunt gave me that name. That's how we do it. My aunt gave me my name. That's my true name. And I'm here to talk about how we lived and how we live, which is all about reciprocity and belonging. This is a neck bag I made for my sister to hold a medicine bundle. It features one of our big medicine plants, the strawberry. So we already spoke the Ohando and Karewatekwan in part, and I would like to refer back to that again. This is a printed version, which I think is great. And I wanted to talk about, to understand how we lived on this land, how we live on this land, you need to understand how we picture ourselves in the world. And I think we got some, I'm sorry, it's a little closer to the mic. I think we got some explanation on that by the opening greetings. The way we look at ourselves in this world is as an equal member of an extended family of beings that include all the living beings, but also a lot of non-living beings, or what a lot of people regard as a non-living being, like the waters, the hills, the trees, as we were talking before. I have to pause myself because I neglected one thing, and it's a very important thing. I apologize to everyone for this. I have to recognize and acknowledge that today we're standing and sitting, working and talking on the homelands of the Skagdekok Mohegan people, known as Skagdekok or Mohicans. The Skagdekok are the people who live in this area as a division of the greater Mohican people. And thank you to Moheganok for us being here today. So the roots of our being here, the roots of our coexistence with our relatives, go very deeply. At this point, if you read Dr. Paulette Steve's book on the late Pleistocene in the Western Hemisphere, she's a brilliant Métis Cree researcher, and she has compiled quite a bit of evidence for deep pre-Clovis occupation, including, I think at this point, 17, maybe 19 verified sites that are in excess of 20,000 years of age. But in our area, I'd like to look at the retreat of the glaciers around 13,000 years ago. This is a pre-Clovis time period with a wonderful paper by Lothrop and Party and company. You can see here that in this deep time, The area is well populated with sites, with villages, and they lay both along seashores, along major rivers, and even inland along small creeks and rivers. And these people living here, there's no real substantive evidence for any kind of migration into this region or out of this region. In fact, when we look at the earliest findings in this whole region that we're looking at here, everything seems to be culturally in place. And as we move forward, it very much appears that the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquian peoples, at least in this region, came to be who they are and who we are. So I'm both Haudenosaunee and Algonquian. I'm Nashwe and Kankahaga, where we are today. And this is a climatic map of New York State. You'll see that it's not uniform in climate, and the area in light blue and in greens are more influenced by the maritime climate, and that roughly outlines, and I say roughly because it's not totally correlating, the homelands of the Algonquian peoples of New York State, whereas the darker blue areas, including some of the enclaves of lighter blue in the rest of the state, is Haudenosaunee homelands. So the people are not uniform. We are different culturally from each other. The land is not uniform. The flora and the fauna are uniform. And we developed ourselves as communities and cultures in response to the very specific nature of the different places we live. We are tailored to our homes. These are comparative maps of Massachusetts and Connecticut, where you can see very easily that they're much more influenced by maritime climate. Again, these are Algonquian spaces. An interesting feature of that is that when you look at, this is a map by Tulweki et al., a recent, probably I think it's 2019, showing the Algonquian and the Haudenosaunee villages and settlements in the period between just before contact, as we know it, up until about 1800. And it's easy to see that in the southeast of New York and outlying areas in Connecticut and Massachusetts, in New Jersey, that the Algonquian people's villages are much more diffuse in their distribution, and that the lands that were more immediately influenced by their activities are also a little bit more diffuse in the area of the map, whereas the Haudenosaunee villages are distinctly concentrated, showing that we lived in different ways, but we were living also in slightly different environments. Here is a current population map of New York State, and you quickly can see, go back for me, that there's almost 1-to-1 and 100% correlation between population centers before and after. So not very original. Y'all just living on where we used to live, but it was in better condition when we took care of it. Apologies. So this is a paper. Thank you for laughing and not being mad. Appreciate that. So a paper, one of many about this one, this particular about Sky Lakes region in southeastern New York. It's a study from sediments and ponds to find out about how things were back in the way deep day. And like many studies, it shows that immediately after the glaciers started to retreat, we had a very taiga-like situation, probably shorter than these trees, though. It's a dense, cool forest. In certain areas along the coast, it was more savanna-like. And that started about 12,000 years ago. Mind you, we're already here. And 13,000 years ago, there was no forest, but we were already here. So the forest developed completely with our influence of interaction. When we get to about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, we have the land's largely covered by deciduous and mixed forest in a slow and very steady warming pattern. When we get to about 6,000 years ago to about 4,000 years ago, there was this period, a double millennium period, of drying and heating that led to dominance of pitch pine, Pinus rigida, across the region, really into New England as well. And a lot of fires going on, natural fires likely, but that changed. After 4,000 before the present, we start to move into what they call the woodland era, for a very good reason, because it becomes very dominantly deciduous woodland, in some places more mixed, warm, moist kind of environmental development, and that's the period that we look at culturally that is what regarded as our modern period, a period, or the present cultures that we have developed. Now, through all of this, we adapted our lifeways. We made great changes to our toolkits, our living patterns, our distribution patterns, the way we lived our lives on this land in response to the changes that were happening to the land in a very granular, intimate, deep millennial understanding kind of way. And this comes forth partly in this book edited by Dr. Steves, who I mentioned before, and Dr. Data. I'm one of many authors, and I'm honored to be included. That Indigenous cultural and environmental heritage should be coming out about the end of the year, being next year by University of Nebraska Press. And in it, I do a little ditty about traditional narrative as document, and I talk about a story called Kapawis Achumagan, which is a Lenapehoking story about a lazy hunter. And in this story, Kapawis, the lazy hunter, is sent out by his wife, who's very irritated with him because he isn't doing any hunting, isn't bringing anything home, and they're starving. So she sends him out to get fish. And in this story, deer are never mentioned, corn is never mentioned, which is a little strange because when we talk about Native people in this region, we constantly talk about deer and corn. But by not including those two things, the story is actually able to relate back to the earliest of times and right up until contact times, because deer moved into this area as deciduous forests moved into this area. But without them, everything in the story could be placed in a paleo time almost, right up until contact time. And it takes place, they're staying the winter in their winter camp next to a good creek that has both little fish and migratory fish, and there's a lot of animals to hunt around there. And Kapawis goes to fish at the creek, and he ends up in a whole bunch of misadventures. He ends up being dragged off up to ledges by a turkey that he's hitched on his line, or in another version, it's geese, and where he encounters red cedar. And we know red cedar as a person. Both Haudenosaunee and Algonquin people know red cedar as a person, as a medicine person, considered a living medicine person, along with white pine. So he's meeting Mohumsen and Papokwis, our grandfather, red cedar. And he's literally caught by our grandfather, red cedar, and goes through this spiritual journey of a literal sort, where his luck entirely changes. And the reason that this story is so important is because it visits all the most important environments of our existence, and without the details of corn and deer, it's actually able to reach across between cultures and families as well. For instance, this story could have very well taken place in Pound Ridge, New York, where there's a large preserve in Westchester County. There's ledges there. There's a large creek there, and it's surrounded by a concentration of every kind of archaeological site, basically, that there is. And so this story could have taken place right there by those ledges and that creek. And in fact, we find that people occupied that area from paleo times right up until contact times. But here we have in Skohele, what they call Skohere Valley. Skohele means wash yourself, get clean. And this is Haudenosaunee, a different language family, different culture, place where here's Mohumsen Papokwis, the red cedar, waiting to catch some stray lazy hunter on his misadventures on top of a cliff, sitting right over Yochitsison Forever Farm, which is a repurchased land by the Ganikahaga people, where we've reestablished our farm and our lifeways at the site of a historic or a somewhat ancient Turtle Clan village, right next to a large creek, just like in the story about Kapawis, which is a Delaware, a Lenape story. Here again is the cliff in the same scenario. You can find this set of scenarios and archaeological sites all over the region in this way. So at that little pond I showed you in Pound Ridge a few slides ago, Ernest Wiegand did some archaeology there, and they did some flotations in hearths, and they found in just 5 little hearths over a long period of time, more than 60 food and medicine plants were being brought home for use there, 3/4 of which depend on either wetland margins for their habitat or mature mesic forests. But that's not how the land is managed today by policy of the land, people who do land management in the government sense. I myself still have 130 species in my personal learnings of medicine between Haudenosaunee and Algonquian people. And we have medicines that heal every kind of healing physical, mental, and spiritual. That's just like one page from my archive. So bringing this together today, this is my husband at a place called Witekenwikit, which means where their heart lives. It's a place where some of my family is laid to rest. It's part of our spiritual practice to go out in the land and consider our place in this world deeply and consider the future generations and how our actions are impacting them. After, as we all know, a certain period, people came from over the seas of many kinds, and those who came here voluntarily came with many origins, religious, zealots and second sons of petty aristocrats and everything else, including a lot of people who were indentured, but they didn't come voluntarily. But those who came voluntarily had two things in common. They came to possess what they could find, and they came with a sense of being entitled to do so. And so it wasn't long after they found out that us native people didn't work out well for them as laborers and slaves, that they went back over the ocean and they brought other indigenous people over here, dislocating them from their homes. And with that, I'm going to pass this on to James Memisor, who's going to continue this story and let us know what happened then. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just going to kind of give you the 2-minute signal, but you ended beautifully. So thank you for that. Part of the working theory that we're trying to understand, not just any particular experiences, but the interrelated experiences, is really the theory that's emerged over recent years, led by many indigenous scholars talking about settler colonialism. But settler colonialism is oftentimes represented further west, not so much grappling with what's going on, let's say, in the New York, what we now think of as the New York, New Jersey region. So that's really the challenge we've taken on in terms of the Public History Project, is how does it actually happen? And what do people know, what they don't know, what are in the archives, hidden in plain sight, and actually kind of ignored systematically. And certainly my daughter grew up in the New York City public school system, and how much was known? Better than before, but still not much. And how so much is erased in the region itself. So the question of settler colonialism is an important one of how we can begin to think about things together across a large ecoregion. And it really is made up of some components that are usually thought of in terms of dispossession of the land, right? But of course, it's also linked, and this is where indigenous scholars have been very careful to think through of its linkage to enslavement itself. Because oftentimes, once the land has been opened up, quote unquote, dispossessed, then who's going to work the land? That becomes a fundamental question. And of course, we know that throughout the eastern seaboard, enslaved Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, and enslaved indigenous people were really put into that role. So that those are the two key components, but it can't be understood without also understanding the way in which nature itself becomes commodified, becomes natural resources, becomes really part of this kind of land management question, and as opposed to stewardship. So there are some there are important emerging questions that are qualitatively and quantitatively different. And so it's really about, in some ways, the massive extraction of the white cedar forest, which used to be the meadowland, for example. And we could go on and on with many examples, and how that begins to happen. So that's, of course, related, and that is oftentimes thought to be linked to, oh, that's massive industrialization, that's what caused this extractivism, that's what caused the CO2, and that's where our problem is. But it's really more fundamental, because it's really a philosophy and a relationship towards humans and natures, and more than humans, what some scholars talk about. But it's also, of course, about trade and the global trade system and the colonial trade system, not just the move for dominion of Christian dominion, but of course also the search for wealth and power through trade. And in some ways, that's what drives the massive extractivism. My earlier work was very much about how the China trade begins to really, is at the foundation of the formation of New York City itself in a way that we tend not to acknowledge. But I didn't realize that I had to go further and further back in time to really look at how it's linked to massive extractivism, searching the terrain for what China wants. Ginseng is among them, but also the cedar forest, what role do they play? What roles do the straight pine trees play in terms of the navies that are sent around, the ships that are sent around to try to make the money? So the intimate relationship between globalization and global trade, massive extractivism, and enslavement and dispossession of the land is something that we tend not to understand, certainly in terms of the making of New York City, right? But that seems to be a very worthy challenge, and the making of New York State, for that matter, the making of Albany, right? So how can we begin to change these narratives away from the mythological stories? And the Dutch were really getting ready to celebrate the 400th anniversary of their discovery of Manhattan, their purchase of Manhattan. So that's in many ways at the foundation of this grouping that we have here. And it's in that light that I welcome James Ememezor. And I asked James how he wanted to be introduced. And James said, I'm passionate about excavating, in quotes, the archives for the, quote, unknown manuscript references to the African experience in New Jersey, because I believe that a lot of what is considered considerable is actually ultimately negligible. We're really just at the tip of the discoveries. And I should just say, James is also very knowledgeable about the region itself. So James Ememezor, who's working with the New Jersey Historical Society especially. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. Good afternoon, and thank you all. I often inform my audience that for them not to be surprised about my accent, that they could probably tell from my accent that I wasn't born close to New Jersey. So that way they can pay more attention to me, and I pay attention as well. So my talk is titled From the Dungeons of Slave Fortresses in Ghana to the Vaults of Enslavement Records in New Jersey, the African in Dispersion. Right, so the African in Dispersion is a theme that it was a course I took when I was studying for my undergraduate in Ghana. And I learned two things, that Africans left the continent of Africa voluntarily and involuntarily. And they did this, particularly the involuntary or voluntary migration. They left on their own as administrators, as soldiers, and all kinds of professions for thousands of years, all right, long before we had contact with Europe. So, and some also left involuntarily across North Africa and across East Africa, long before we had contact with Europe. So I just want to make that very clear, that the African in Dispersion is very dear to me. And so having studied this, I became interested in the African in Dispersion through the transatlantic slave trade. So that is what I want to do. And that is why New Jersey is connected to my talk. Now, my plan is to give you some idea about pre-European West African polities and patterns of trade. That way we have some idea about the transatlantic slave trade, and also talk about the coming of the Europeans, and later missionaries and colonizers. But we won't talk about them today because we don't have time. And I also want to talk about my experience working at one of the slave fortresses that were built by Europeans called Pequot Castle, which was the headquarters of the busiest slave trading companies in the 18th century, the English. And then I also want to talk about my work experience at the New Jersey Historical Society, where I focus on discovering and documenting references that were overlooked or ignored or considered marginal to history that reference African people, because my goal is not to write about this, but to make them available as nuggets for other people to write about. So that is what I want to do. Now, but as part of this, to do it very well, we need to take a look at the transatlantic slave trade, but the origin of it. I just want you to have an idea about West Africa broadly. We don't have time to go into this in greater detail, but before Europeans came to West Africa, particularly 1400s, there were at least 3 great empires that emerged between 700 AD, and some believe they emerged years before then. And the first one was the Ghana Empire, and declined around 1200 AD. And of course, there was another empire that arose, Mali, the Empire of Mali, and you can see them on the screen. It also declined around 1500. By the time Europeans were arriving, Mali was declining. And then there was another empire, the Songhai Empire. And Songhai Empire, Mali Empire, there was a particular place called Timbuktu, which was a center of trade, culture, and learning during this time period, going back. So we hear about the Timbuktu manuscripts, for instance. Now, these empires and societies had their own form of trade. Again, they were trading across the Saharan desert. So the Saharan desert had never been a barrier. It has always been a highway. And you can see the trade routes, quite a lot of them linking North Africa and then West Africa. And what were some of the major trade goods? Salt from North Africa towards the south, and of course, from the south, ivory, cola, and particularly gold. And so the Portuguese knew about this largely because by 13th century or 14th century, a very famous African king called Mansa Musa traveled to Mecca, carried so much gold that gold price fell completely, and there was so much inflation. So people heard about how rich gold was coming from Africa. So the Portuguese were interested in going there. So by 1471, they had arrived on the coast, and other Europeans followed over time. And the North African trade, or the trans-Saharan trade, shifted westward as a result of European coming. Now, so you can see, European traders arrived by 1400s onwards. So as a result of the gold, Portuguese landed at a place called Elmina. You can see it on my screen. Elmina means, or from Portuguese means the mine. Right? So we found the mine. This is the mine. So almost every other European traders were rushing to have a piece of the gold. And over time, quite a number of European trading companies arrived and traded. So trade initially was a mutual one with respect. Over time, it changed into trading Africans. So as you can see, the coastline of Ghana is about 300 miles. But at some point, about 40 to 50 European forts and lodges and castles were built because of rivalry for resources. And so you can see that. Cape Coast Castle is one of those buildings, and I happen to work there. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. Now, these are some of the companies that operated on the coast of West Africa, trading in minerals, and later on Africans. Now, Cape Coast Castle in particular, you can see some of the European companies and their flags, starting with Portugal. Portugal has some control over Cape Coast Castle at some point, and then the Swedes, and the Danes, and of course, the Dutch and the English. So Cape Coast Castle was built over time into what we have today, sitting there. And you can see some of the guns or cannons that are facing the ocean. They are not facing the land, they are facing the ocean. Why? Because rivalry from other European powers. So control of resources. And that is how this trade developed. Now, this is part of the castle, slave dungeon, male slave dungeon. These were some locals and foreigners who were touring the place, because Cape Coast Castle has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So people from different parts of the world go there, and that's where I was working. So these individuals were going underground or dungeons where Africans were held until the slave ships were available before they could be transported. This is a section of the male slave dungeon. There are about 5 of these sections. And so you can only see there was light there because of electricity extended into the building nowadays. And but in the absence of electricity, the opening there, you can see, was the only place that gave you an idea whether it was day or night. So individuals were held there until the boats arrived before they were transported. And of course, a lot of people died. And some of these captives were brought from far away places, stayed there until the slave ships arrived. Now, that was me in 2001, giving a tour, educating people. So that's basically what I did. Cape Coast Castle and other forts and lodges were places that once separated the families and loved ones, mothers from fathers, mothers from sons and daughters, and so forth and so forth. Today, these sites also bring people back, researchers, tourists, students, to reflect, to learn about enslavement, dispossession, and reflect about our future together. Now, so other people come, they are not only nationals, locals, but foreigners as well. You can see on the screen 2 images. The first one labeled Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north. And this is a story from Rhode Island, Bristol specifically. A family from Rhode Island, one of them called Katrina, is one among those individuals. Katrina Brown said she was growing up and realized that almost everybody in her family was well-to-do. Almost everybody went to Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. So she was asking herself, why are we so different? What makes us so unique that most everybody is successful? Then her grandmother pulled her aside one day and whispered into her ears and said, our ancestors were slave traders. So that was revealed to her. And that story did not sit well with her. So what she did was she sent letters to about 100 of her relatives, telling them to meet so they could discuss their heritage. And about 90% of them wrote back, said, don't drag the family name into any such discussion. Leave us alone. But about 10 of them who were willing got together, and then they discussed what needed to be done, because they couldn't sit comfortably with the story they had, because they inherited or had a heritage. So they got together and decided to go to Ghana to trace the trade, the triangular trade. Right, so that's where I met them, and I was featured in a documentary called Traces of the Trade. But they collected information from there and went to Cuba, where the ancestors also owned plantations. Then they went back to Bristol, got together, thought about what all these things meant for them. So they came out with this documentary. It's very beautiful and very educative. Please, I encourage everybody who can to do so. Then on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, one of the members, who is also in the picture, wrote a book called Inheriting the Trade. And as you can see, a northern family confronts its legacy as the largest slave trading dynasty in US history. By the way, one of the family members was the second richest man by 1790s in the United States. So these stories are very important. This is what I did, met with people. So by the time I left, by the way, you can see also here, Cape Coast Castle, that was a very famous person for President Barack Obama in 2009. In other words, Cape Coast Castle and all the other forts and lodges, quite a number of them are edifices. They are also metaphors of the experience of the African in dispersion, right? The transatlantic trade in particular. So I left Cape Coast Castle, left Ghana, coming to the United States, knowing very well that the African dispersion, or people of African descent through the transatlantic slave trade, are found almost everywhere in the Western world. So I carried this with me. And then I also learned that as part of the slave trade, new ideas evolved, like slavery being free trade, right? What the French describe as laissez-faire capitalism, right? Free trade. We take these things for granted. The concept of free trade, we love it, but it has its roots stepping into slavery broadly. Now, so I left Cape Coast Castle with some deep impressions. I read one book by a Ghanaian author called Cape Coast Castle, a collection of poems. And then there were lasting impressions that I carry with me. One of them says, slavery is the living wound under the patchwork of scars. A whole time has passed, yet whole nations cry, sometimes softly, sometimes harshly, often without knowing why. And I want you to think about that for a second. Slavery is the living wound. It's a wound that has not healed. So very often, sometimes things scratch the surface, then we cry harshly, sometimes, softly. Sometimes we don't even know why we're crying. And that reminds me of the death of George Floyd, for instance. The whole nation cried. And not everybody knew what was going on. Then there's a second quote says that the captured African left behind them graves without bodies in the collective memory of the surviving folks. So graves without bodies, right? Just imagine the people who were victims of the Atlantic slave trade. They were captured and sold. So a mother went to farm, came back, and could not find her son. And that son could not be found. But at some point, they imagined that son probably died back. When you die, you leave a grave. We bury you, we know exactly. But in the case of the Africans who were captured, they left graves without bodies in the collective memory of the surviving folks. So these were very important things that I learned while I was working there. And I came to the United States to study, found myself at the New Jersey Historical Society, which is one of the oldest institutions in New Jersey, cultural institutions, and I learned a lot. One of the things I learned was go through resources like this, manuscript materials. And one that stood out to me has to do with the land deeds, in the middle of the land deeds involving free black people. So I got to know that free black people also own land. We don't have time, so I'm not going to bother you with the rest of the things. But what I want to say is that based on the original constitution of settling New Jersey, it was agreed that if anybody could come and bring an enslaved person, you will get 75 acres of land, right? So how this played out, how was land then distributed? You can see from the top there that 1675, quite a number of people. There was one individual who came from the Caribbean called John Bessie. He brought 32 Africans, and 32 Africans times 75 acres of land, he got about 240 acres of land for bringing enslaved people. Very important. Of course, I won't go through this. Right, what I want to say in effect is that the settling of New Jersey and the conditions that were attached led into what we call class formation, masters, free persons, weaker slaves, and so forth and so forth. It also set in motion the beginning of our inequality. All right? Inequality we talk about today started a long time ago. It also led to dispossession of land. Native Americans lost their land, subjugation, colonization, marginalization, and so forth and so forth. Africans were also not only enslaved people, but they were free Africans as well. We don't talk about them very often. But here is a case where in 1684, a black man called Johann Antoine Roberts, a free-born black man in New Jersey, desiring to buy land from the proprietors. He wanted to buy 200 acres of land. The proprietors agreed to sell him 100 acres, and the land should be surveyed. But where is the evidence of this land? Because we overlooked them. And these are the sources that have been ignored in the archives that I am interested in excavating. Here is a piece of information where in 1682, all right, there was an instruction given to one of the deputy proprietors, deputy governor, asking him to intervene to inform the local chief, sergeants, Indian chief to not entertain black people who were coming. In other words, separation of black people from Native Americans because they were suspicious. And I'll talk about this, then I will bring it to a close. One important discovery that I came across recently had to do with an uprising in Kings County in New York. We very often hear about rebellions in the colonies. One of them was the most famous in New York was 1741. But before then, there was one in 1712. But I came across this document, which is in Dutch, actually, but it was an instruction from Henry Falcon, who was a lieutenant colonel of Kings County, to one captain to go and suppress a slave revolt in 1706 in New York City, in what is now Brooklyn. I haven't studied this carefully, but my point is for people to know that Africans who were brought here, some were free. Of course, those who were not free also did not sit passively, right, to be enslaved, but they put up resistance because of the treatment they received, and they were not happy. And so these are some of the things that we have to, deal with. Now, to bring this to a close, what do I want you to know? From my presentation, I want you to reflect on these quotes again, that slavery is the living wound under the patchwork of scars. A lot of time has passed, and yet whole nations cry sometimes softly, sometimes harshly, often without knowing why. And not only that, the captured African left behind bodies, graves without bodies, in the memory of the surviving folks. So there's some healing that needs to be done. And to find ways, meaningful ways to acknowledge and treat these wounds, and honor our ancestors, honor the graves, the bodies without graves, who are sacred sites. Maybe just the beginning of the long deferred process of humanizing, acknowledging our stories, the readers of the past, building real relationships, repairing relationships, and of course, healing our communities. And of course, what do we want us to do? I want all of us to maybe change makers. Like Katrina in the presentation, Katrina Brown, the producer of Traces of the Trade, she heard that story, did not sit down comfortably, did something about it to change other people's perception. Like her cousin, Thomas DeWolf, the author of the book Inherited the Trade, did something to acknowledge that we inherited the trade, something we can do about it. Now, let us all be change makers, and when we do so, we are on course to repair our relationships individually, repair our communities, and of course, repair our nations. Thank you very much.
This is just the beginning of the discussion. Last night when we were at this Sunhee Korean restaurant in Troy, which I definitely recommend to people, that we were talking about what questions does James have for Noham and Noham have for James. So in some ways, this is the appetizer. This is just the beginning of a discussion that should be happening and has to be happening, because if we're actually truly reckoning with the complexities of how the present, past, future, multiple places from Rhode Island to New Jersey to, for example, the Procter & Gamble family. I'd been working during the time of George Floyd and the reckoning with George Floyd with the Gamble family. And they're trying to think through how did one of their ancestors, who was a doctor, how did that ancestor get involved in the issues of eugenics and sterilization, for example? So there's multiple complexities here that are not just about any one moment in the case of the DeWolf family, but the ongoing legacy of this reckoning that has to go on. The other thought that I had, which is a trilateral discussion, which is really the point about slavery and free trade, as free trade is the ideology of free trade as we now think of it, free trade as a virtue that the economy should have. Slavery certainly was a part of that, as was the Opium War. The Opium War was argued on the behalf of the British and the Americans that should be okay because it's really free trade, right? Inflicting opium on nation as a means of, should be free for the merchants who are involved in that effort. So there's multiple discussions that we're starting to need, and in some ways the work of Teresa Vega is right at that intersection between indigenous, African American, European, and a global kind of trade and movement of people. When I asked when I asked Teresa what she would like to say about her own work, she said the past is always present. Resistance, refuge, and survival are in her blood itself. So Teresa Vega.
Good afternoon, everybody. Where's the magic button here? I am Teresa Vega, and I figured today, I didn't know what exactly I was going to say, but since they all so far have raised issues that intersect with mine, I'm going to focus on what it is that I do and how it intersects with all the conversations that we've had here. So I begin by this graphic here of a brown, or it could have been a black or an Afro-Indigenous or a red hand going through wheat fields, because wheat and other grains didn't just go west, they went east, and they traveled very, very far. And so one of the things about 30 years ago, I started getting into genealogy. My grandfather's first cousin, Yvonne, she handed me over her, the research that she had been doing. And she said, we have a history of being from Rhode Island. We descend from General Nathaniel Greene's line, that we had a black patriot, and that some of our ancestors came up from the South. And she was adamant about the fact that we were Afro-Indigenous. And having been raised by my grandparents, I was always that little kid. Maybe it's because I'm a Gemini with a Gemini rising sign. I just listen to these stories, and I'm just a curious child. So I always wanted to know the details. How do you know this? And as someone who grew up in Plymouth County, my maternal grandmother's line has Wampanoag, Mashpee Wampanoag roots. I recently found out that my granddad also had that, and we'll be discussing this. But I always was that child that, okay, this is what they said, but can I prove it? And some people in both African and in indigenous cultures, we are an oral-based, two people who have oral-based histories. And when you talk about decolonizing the archives where everything is written, and people unquestionably are okay with that level of speculation, but yet our oral history is looked down upon as not being legit. I was one of those kids say, well, I got to prove them wrong, right? And I'm so happy that I did. So I begin here by wanting to say that as a descendant, my eyes are always glued to the stories of my ancestors. Okay, I descend from everybody. 400 plus years, millennia, I am indigenous. African, I can trace my ancestry back to one of the first 11 Africans from Angola. One of the first, another ancestor was 8th great-grandfather, was the last Black colonial landowner in the land of the Blacks. I have another 8 times great-grandfather who was captured on a Spanish or Portuguese ship. He was a sea captain and became a prize. You know, I can go on and on. I descend from Abraham Jansen Van Saley, one of the first Afro-Dutch, along with his brother Anthony. There are all these people. So when I approach my level of research, it is that I descend from everybody here. I also descend from, since we're in a very famous place, where my family descends from the Schuylers. We're both enslaved descendants of the Schuylers, the Van Cortlands, the Van Rensselaers, not to let the British feel left out, but the Ogdens, the Morris family, and many, many, many folks. So I want to say this, but when you deal with two peoples, I should say, and who survived genocide, enslavement, dispossession, forced immigration, and deportation, because a lot of people forget that indigenous people were the first to be enslaved, and they were forcibly removed to places like the Bahamas, the Mediterranean, England, and we believe parts of Africa as well. I also descend from two indigenous people. Africans were indigenous to Africa and indigenous Native Americans here. And they recognized similar qualities, whether it was in food pathways, spiritual pathways, their relationship to the environment, etc. They realized that there were some similarities that they shared, and they were able to band together and survive, this settler colonialism that was forced upon them. In late 1990s, mid 1990s, Cousin Yvonne, when she gave me her handwritten notes, she said, "This is what I found out. I'm retiring. I'm up here. You run with it." And I said, okay. And I've had an Ancestry.com account for decades, but I would only do it like now and then and let it slip and then go back. So she asked me to look something up, and I was on there like 2 weeks, and then I looked up, and I was like, I can get email on here? And my third cousin had contacted me, and she spent 1.5 years contacting me. And I finally just wrote her, just call me. And she's been my research partner since then, by the first ever blog. And I should have said that QR code. How do I go back? This QR code will take you to my blog, because I can't cover everything. And this QR code, which I should have spent a lot, well, stay on this slide. This QR code takes you to a paper I published on repairing erasure and paper genocide. So one of the things Andrea and I found out when we connected was that we're so confused. Why? We're told we're Afro-Indigenous, but people are popping up as white, as Negro, free people of color. And it was a little bit confusing until we were like, wait a minute. And we found out about how indigenous people were erased on paper. So those people who always want to go back to the 1790 census because A, it's the first census and it's empirical evidence, they have to remember it did not include us. If you are going to take people's land, dispossess them of their land, one of the first things you have to do is you can't call them Native American. You have to call them something else, and that's what we call. But in that paper, you'll discuss. It'll be a full discussion of that. One of the things we decided to do was about 2010, 2013, 2010, around that time, 23andMe was really big then. Everybody was starting to do DNA. And we said, well, why don't we do that to break down brick walls? Because literally every line on our tree was facing the same problem. We didn't know who these people were, which names. So one of the things that happened really quickly was I concentrated, with James's help many years ago, in New Jersey, where my granddad was born and raised. And I found out, wait a minute, his father was mulatto, but then his grandfather was mulatto. Wait a minute, what's going on here? And we were able to trace that line and connect it to our first Underground Railroad house. We have 6, which we will be discussing in a minute. But it became clear that we had a lot of ties to early abolitionists. We later found out that there were ties to both free Black settlements and Afro-Indigenous settlements. A lot of them are listed here on the slide, especially in the lower Hudson Valley, but also throughout Connecticut up the East Coast to Massachusetts. And as you can see, some of these names might look familiar. There's no surprise when you're dealing with a small population of first Africans who are concentrated in the same area. And at this particular time, especially on my Afro-Dutch line, we're moving into banishment land, AKA Brooklyn and Long Island, where you still have indigenous people, where settler colonizers did what they've always done around the world, and that is to form alliances with indigenous chiefs, people, and then marry off their daughters. You also, of course, have consensual and non-consensual unions taking place. But we were able, over the course of, starting in like 2013 or so, we started using genetic genealogy and testing different lines on our family, oldest people, like with preferences. And so what we tend to do, I happen to be in New York City at a genealogy conference, just so happened Cece Moore of Finding Your Roots was there, and she was having one of her conversations of what gets lost on the cutting room floor. And she mentioned that the episode with Ben Affleck, Benjamin Jealous, and I forget the other comedian, she mentioned Benjamin Jealous, his mother had a haplogroup that was Malagasy, and that she had never heard about that. And, Teresa's right here, hey, because we knew our line was M23, only found in Madagascar. So when we found that out, and Andrea's a direct matrilineal descendant of now we can go back to our 6th great-grandmother, who was born circa 1730 in Orange County, or it could be Manhattan, we're not too sure. But she asked me if I would be a co-admin of her FTDNA's Malagasy project. And it just so happened, like maybe 2 weeks ago, I was in the Indian Ocean World Center Conference talking about what I'm talking about now, how you use genetic DNA testing in order to uncover hidden histories. So we decided to embrace genetic genealogy. How many people have taken a DNA test? Okay. If you don't know, there's 3 different, well, I'd say 3 here, different kinds. So your mitochondrial DNA is your mother's line. And and opposite that is Y DNA. That's your father's line. Those haplogroups go back anywhere from tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it charts humankind's emergence out of East Africa to where they ended up. The caveat here is someone like me, my mother's line, my 2nd great-grandmother was the 1st generation Irish, so although I look like a cute little colored me, my haplogroup, my maternal line is Ireland. My maternal aunt is 32% Irish, So how you physically look today doesn't necessarily determine what your ancestors look like. It just means that your maternal or paternal line came from a specific geographical area, okay? Autosomal DNA testing is different. When you do autosomal DNA, it's your chromosomes 1 to 22. If you get 50% of your DNA from your mother, 50% from your father. So what we tend to do is we test our cousins to find out where their line tested. So, for instance, we tested my Anthony Green line. And one of the things about Y-DNA is, unlike mtDNA, it gives you the actual surname. Women's surnames change, so you get your matches on your paternal line, and that could either prove or disprove your origin. So when we did this, we found our Anthony Green wasn't an Anthony Green, he was a Freeman. Okay? And then we were like, Freeman, where did that come from? I'm going to get there. Then, so we knew that that line, it couldn't have been a Green male who, even though the surname was Green, that was his father. It was someone who had EM2, which is a haplogroup found where? In Madagascar. And I'll tell you why, because it goes back to trade. And then we eventually found his runaway slave ad. I'm jumping ahead. And we were like, wait a minute, if this history says we're Afro-Indigenous, what's going on here? So it had to come from his mother, right? But we didn't have anybody to test for the maternal line. But what we had instead was his runaway slave ad, which described him as yellow, and from there we realized that they didn't have DNA test in 1780, but it came back that it was, it has to be indigenous because they said in the runaway slave ad that he was a quarter indigenous and he was yellow. So that means that a grandparent had to be full-blooded indigenous. I'm gonna, let me go back. So where does that get me? So here, when we were talking about the 6 Underground Railroad houses, one of the things we've been able to do is use genetic genealogy and find other DNA cousins, and we have now 6 houses. We have in Peekskill, New York, the Howley Green House. We are related to both Howley Green and to Harriet Peterson, whose line it connects to Jack Peterson's line. We have in Noyack, Cynthia and Edward Hestra. I am actually related to both of them. We also have in Jersey City, Johnson Way, and those are the descendants of people who come out of Skunk Hollow. We have in Greenwich, Byram, the Thomas J. Lyon House, and we also have the Jacob D. King House in Newark, and via our Hetty family and our Van Saley's family, we're connected to the George Ware houses in Buffalo and in Rochester. And what people don't realize is that the Underground Railroad, the early Underground Railroad, is connected by family ties. If people want to know how Black abolish operated, they operated by family ties. This one marrying that one. I have a whole genealogy tree of a very endogamous early free Black and Afro-Indigenous mixed race company. This QR code is about my new article where I go into detail about all of the connections. And then, last but not least, if you can't beat them, you join them. I have 2 books coming out next year where the first one is going to be talking about all of our revolutionary war ancestors who are African, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous. That's Laura Thompson, my 2 times great-grandmother, and that is her grandfather in AI form. I don't know what he looked like. I was just playing with AI. I will never upload it. Do not upload AI photos to Ancestry. No, do not do that. That QR code is to my first article on him. Sam Freeman has a second article coming out on him any day now, which I will be publishing on my blog, and we will be discussing in detail the DNA, the more information on the Van Saleys, the Afro-Dutch, and next year I will be producing 2 books that will bring all this together, and hopefully it'll inform folks about how to do deep dives and combine the latest skills with this. And all of this we found out from the maritime trade, which we will be talking about again. Thank you.
So you could just begin to see the interweaving that's going on in the dialogue process. And in many ways, these are underground networks. And of course, those who are very familiar with the new research on forests and trees is that, of course, these are, the forest is created and supported by these underground networks of mycelium, right? So in some ways, we're not so much saying that as humans, we're that much different than nature, and in fact we are part of nature, and that these underground and interlinking connections are all there. So part of the division that we're very prone to is, first of all, the separation between what are considered the human sciences and social sciences and humanities and history from nature itself and from natural history. And part of what we feel we have to insist on, and also deals with the question of the kind of missing dimension of what nature and what life is about in terms of spirituality and whether rivers are alive, whether forests are alive. These fundamental questions are now being contested not just in academia, but also in legal cases all around the world. There's really this kind of question of what happens with extreme extractivism and what has been the price of what has happened. We can call it settler colonialism, we can call it whatever we want, but really looking at the interlinkages between these processes that need to be understood together. So when I asked Kerry Hardy how he wanted to be described, he says that he's afflicted by the ecologist disease, and that he is fixated on how whole systems operate, the how and why, and the when and where, and that's really, in some ways, the undergirding of our understanding of what we're doing as an ecoregion itself. And in this way, it actually converges back. It circles back to indigenous and both Afro-Indigenous, African Indigenous, and also indigenous notions of the interrelationships of the landscape itself and the spirituality that's involved. So Kerry Hardy. And then we're going to have a little bit of time for some discussion, and if some people have some questions. I'm not sure how our time is doing, Devin. We're tight on time, but we're going to wrap up after this. Thank you.
Though I live in Maine now, I was once a New York State resident, primarily for the purpose of getting cheaper tuition at the landscape architecture school at the SUNY Forestry College in Syracuse. And one of the people who spoke when I was a student there a million years ago was Ian McHarg, who was a famous landscape architect, a National Book Award winner, I think, in 1964 maybe. Maybe later than that, for design with nature. And I've always, this quote of McHarg's has always resonated with me. Our work in the Public History Project, public history to me is finding the lost voices in history. We all know what heroic history looks like. We grew up having it kind of stuffed down our throats. But a history that contains the voices of the losers, the downtrodden, the animals or the ecosystems that are never given voice in our European culture, although we may be getting there with some rights of nature legislation that's creeping forward. anyway, that's why I do the public history, is looking for those lost voices. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some of the things that our extractive approach to this new world that we found, some of the consequences of it that you can recognize here in New York State, and how they may have shaped history in New York State. Going back to the time of first European contact over here, surprise, surprise, it was gold that brought the Europeans over. And very quickly, everyone wanted to be the Spanish or the Portuguese because of the gold and silver they found. Here you can see one of the Inca chiefs being very helpful to his Spanish questioner about the location of the gold and silver mines. So one of the first questions all the explorers would ask when they arrived in what would become New York or New England or anywhere over here is, do you have any places where you can get stones like this? And there aren't many in this part of the world. So it wasn't gold that launched the European experiment here. It was they couldn't have gold fever, so they turned to beaver fever, because that was something they could find here was lots of fur, which Europe wanted. Whether we're talking about beaver or any other creation out there, it's sad to me how much understanding of our history in this country can be learned just by following the simple mantra of follow the money. If you wonder why something happened in New York or in America, follow the money, and you'll find that if it was something that worked for the Schuyler's or the Livingstons or the Portlands or the Washingtons or the Franklins, anyway, follow the money, and you'll very often see how and why history was made. To get back to beaver, here's an example of the extractive approach. I just crunched some numbers, and these are rough numbers based on how many beavers ought to be present in an undisturbed landscape. You can see in the 13,500 square miles of the Hudson Mohawk watershed, there would be about 10 times that number of beavers. So in one year, 1632, the Dutch, just by chance, happened to ship 13,500 beaver pelts down. You could say they decimated them in that it was a tenth of the population. And that's hard on any species. But when you do it to what ecologists call a keystone species, which beavers are, because so many other organisms depend on beavers and the ponds that they create to find their own place to live, whether you're talking about wood ducks or frogs, turtles, anything. So that was unsustainable, and that's why by 1635, the French and the native of Network Americans who traded with them had already expanded west of Lake Superior in terms of where they were drawing beaver pelts from. Now, I should go back. This is tricky stuff to teach because, among other things, rivers are very squiggly lines, and they don't always make visual sense to us. And a lot of times they have Native American names, and those languages don't make sense to us. So to teach people about beavers and how they affected our early history here, I break it down into a subway map. So you can, and usually I do these as a series of pop-in slides, one at a time. But my friend and mentor is also holding the clock on me today, so I've just given you one slide as an example, but to talk you through it, and this is about 1740. The oldest and longest established is the dark red line representing the St. Lawrence River, which Champlain recognized was the key to controlling the North American fur trade. The next most important line is the purple line of the Hudson. The Hudson was like a giant drinking straw into the milkshake of the North American continent, and that's how, Hudson sailed up it and recognized the potential. It's why Albany and New Amsterdam evolved together at the same time. Albany was just as important. One was the supply, and then one was the shipping port. The Dutch very quickly realized if they armed the Native Americans that they traded with, they could extend up the Mohawk River, the Blue Line, and even give the Canadians a little bit of trouble at places like the Great Lakes, or especially at Oswego, which was a key choke point and the site of a lot of bloody battles as the French and the English eventually vied for supremacy in the fur trade here. Then the real fun stuff for me is the Green Line, because that's getting ahead a little bit, but only to 1682, when William Penn said, this Susquehanna River goes up and touches the Mohawk at Lake Otsego, and if I can get the whole Susquehanna drainage, I could intercept the fur trade there, bring it down the Susquehanna, and with a short overland passage, ship all of the furs of North America, perhaps, out of Philadelphia. Word of this reached Governor Dongan back in New York, and he and his merchant friends were not going to have that, and they made a preemptive strike and bought the Susquehanna from the Five Nations themselves. And in the process, they introduced Native Americans to the concept of, you've conquered these other Native American groups, therefore all of their lands are yours by conquest. Those are the European game rules, and we would buy them from you. That was basically the quote from Penn to the Five Nations chieftains. And that's a very dramatic departure from Native American thinking, the idea of owning land or selling big tracts of land. But if it's from people you conquered, you're not giving your own homeland away, so that the sales happen. All right, I'm going to move as quickly as I can from one species to another. We could talk about beavers in the early fur trade for weeks, but I won't, because I want to talk about oysters. When this project first started for me 7 years ago, one of the first things I said to Jack was, we may find out that New York City is only where it is because of oysters. And nothing that I've learned since then has changed my mind that that's probably the greatest single reason why it's there. To help orient you, the light blue area is a gigantic oyster bank. Statue of Liberty is up at the northern tip of it there on Ellis Island, right under the word 1643 encampment. That giant oyster bank that runs from Jersey City down to Bayonne, 7 square miles in extent, is where the Native Americans went in the dead of winter when they were attacked by Dutch armed groups to the north and driven, they thought, to the protection of the New Amsterdam folks. They encamped on the edge of that oyster bed because you can always find shellfish any season of the year. That was their emergency food, and that's where they went and fell into Keefe's massacre in 1643, or the Pavonia massacre. But that oyster resource is one that had been utilized by Native Americans for millennia. All of their foot trails brought them there. The one coming from the west, today we call it Route 9 or Communipaw Avenue. But oysters in a dish, just like beavers, it's not just the oysters themselves, it's that they're a keystone species, and many species of diving ducks that eat them at all stages of life, species of fish that can crunch them up, big fish that eat the fish that come to eat the oysters up. they're all tied together ecologically. So you're doing double or triple damage when you eliminate oysters, which the Dutch, followed by the English, managed to do, because by the late 1800s, that was almost completely under a railroad yard, and now it's under Liberty State Park. If you want to get a really good grounding on conditions in pre-revolutionary America from an environmental point of view, this is indispensable reading. Per Kalm's Travels in America. He documented all of the environmental destruction. He called himself a natural economist because the word ecologist wasn't in use then. But that was what he looked at, was how people lived with the land. And he saw multiple systems on the verge of collapse here from the extraction without stewardship that had already gone on. So I won't dwell on him. You can see some of the things he noticed, but it's really worth reading his Travels in America, especially because he became friends with John Bartram, who was the best naturalist in America at the time, and also became friends with Benjamin Franklin, who could illuminate the political and economic reasons behind what Kalm was seeing. So this is Kalm came to visit New York, and when it was a healthy estuarial ecosystem at the mouth of the Hudson, this is what not just Native Americans had access to, but what all the other species had access to. You know, it was a real hotbed of life, and not maybe the best place to put a big city. In terms of what was then sacrificed in order to have a port city, which is how the European mind worked. The Hudson was their straw into the milkshake. New York City was where the product would be shipped from around the world to bring money from international trade in. Here's an example of, as we get close to the Revolutionary War, the dark cross-hatching is the range of sugar maple. The purple area is where English colonists were in this country as of 1763. One of the things they were most interested in and being coached to do was to liquidate forests and make potash. Europe had an insatiable appetite for potash. For, among other reasons, you used it to make gunpowder. You also used it in textile milling processes, in fulling mills. So Americans were encouraged economically and through policies, government policies from the British, to send as much potash. Burn as much forest as you can. Don't burn evergreens, just burn sugar maple, beech, or elm, because out of those you get a wonderful yield of only 700 pounds of live tree required to make 1 pound of potash. Except you also, after you drizzle water through the wood ashes, you need to cut more wood to evaporate the water, the lye, to wind up with the final product of potash. So more like 1,000 pounds of living tree to get that 1 pound of potash, which you'd be paid. I think they rewarded them about 3 pence per bushel for the wood ashes. So, you know, not good natural economics, but it was good enough human economics that they could buy land, liquidate forest, and use the proceeds to buy more land, because everybody sort of who came here from England sort of wanted to be their own feudal lord with this cheap land in America. This is just a quick look at how resource sometimes affects history. The Jersey Highlands, which you can see is the kind of lumpy diagonal swath here, are full of iron. This was discovered fairly early on, but by the time of the Revolution, those iron mines all through the Jersey Highlands and up into Connecticut even were key from a strategic point of view because the iron and the steel made from it was what allowed the Americans to fight the war. So when Washington chose his winter camps, they were all strategically chosen so that he could defend the iron mines and the people converting the iron into weapons of war. And if you, I found this slide to be mind-boggling. This is the number of mines that we have in the New Jersey and the Jersey Highlands up into New York. Each of those orange circles is more than 100 mines. So that's a lot of holes in the ground, and you can see why the American Industrial Revolution was centered in this part of the world, because we had not only the iron, but the other products that you needed. The trees to reduce into charcoal, which allowed you to make pig iron at the rate of 20 tons of live trees required to make the charcoal to make a ton of pig iron. So that's a better ratio than potash anyway. I think one of the iron mines in New Jersey made the news last week, maybe, when a hole opened up on Route 80. Yeah. Was it a big hole?
It's not the only one, it's the most recent one.
The most, okay, yeah. It will, wow. Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah? Oh, great. Well, here's one of the big ones, the Mount Pleasant mine, with, in the same scale, the George Washington Bridge. So you could just about stuff the bridge down into that iron mine. And now go back to that slide and see the hundreds of them that we have, and you realize there's a lot that's been taken out of the ground here. Going to wrap up as quick as I can, but here's another just poster child, literally, ginseng root, which kind of looks like a person, or the most valuable ones do. Tremendous demand for it in Asia, and discovered in this country, the first European to discover it was a Jesuit priest in 1718. The French quickly organized a trading company and started trading it to China. By 1784, once the Americans had won their war and were free to export, they loaded up a ship as quickly as they could and sent it off to China. And as George Washington was traveling around, taking a little break after the Revolutionary War, going west over the Appalachians, he commented that everyone else is coming this way, and they have all the ginseng they can carry, and that was headed to the Empress. 2 years later, John Jacob Astor got his grub stake that enabled him to spin out his fortune in fur trading by buying all the ginseng he could, and he realized $55,000 in silver from China. Just from this one load that he sent over, which was equal to about $1.2 million today. So I think I've extended my time. The last seed I want to plant with you is that think of land sales as an extractive practice too. And this is just an example of the size of the chunks of land that have gone to the chosen people throughout New York's history. And I especially, and all of these speculators, not all of them, most of them died in the poorhouse because the greed for land and getting as much as they could, they all fell victim to the carrying costs. But the one thing on here I really wanted to point out, the two gray areas were military tracts. Land was used as the reward for getting soldiers to join your army and fight your battles. So up around where we are, and from here up to Lake Champlain, those military tracts were actually rewards to British officers after the French and Indian War. They even predate the Revolution. So land as an extractive commodity where you take it out of a biotic commons and instead make it the domain, or you make it a tool of individual wealth creation. I would argue that that's the worst and biggest extractive process that we've seen in this country. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm sorry for running in.
Obviously, we didn't budget enough time for this great presentation and this great panel, but I want to thank you all for presenting. And since we don't have time and we need to use this room for the next session, if the panel is willing to hang around outside, if anyone has any questions, you can approach them on that. But thank you so much again. And so we're going to just adjust our time and maybe eliminate some of the breaks later this afternoon, but we're soldiering on. So thank you.